When you think about all the organizations out there doing good work, trying to help people, it makes you wonder what really makes a Christian humanitarian group, well, Christian in how they operate.
Hmm. It's a big question, especially now with so much need globally.
Absolutely. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into Christian humanitarianism, specifically looking at it through the lens of churches in the majority world.
Yeah, we've got some fascinating material here from Christian humanitarianism through the lens of the church in the majority world.
And our goal really is to unpack what happens when Christian faith intersects with, responding to suffering on this massive global scale.
We want to explore how Christians in the majority world see Western Christian aid agencies. We'll look at the history, some of the theology involved.
Right, try and get a richer, maybe more nuanced picture of something that's actually pretty complex.
Definitely complex, but so important.
Okay, so maybe let's start with the roots. Where does this idea of humanitarianism even come from?
Well, it's interesting. If you go back to the early church, Peter Brown, he called Christian charity in the Roman Empire a revolution. It was just radically different.
A revolution? Wow, how so?
Well, think about it. Before that, charity was often different. Christians brought this idea of universal care, looking after anyone in need. And Broodman mentions this expectation that bishops should be lovers of the poor. It was built into the leadership structure.
So it was foundational, really, a core part of the faith from early on.
Absolutely. But then things start to shift a bit. You get figures like Jean-Henri Dunant.
Ah, the founder of the Red Cross, right?
Exactly, mid-19th century. Now, Dunant himself was deeply religious, but the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, it was set up deliberately as secular.
Neutral.
Okay, so that's a key moment, a move towards a non-religious model.
Yes. And that secular neutral model, based on universal principles, became, hugely influential for lots of organizations that followed. And yet, after World War II, Christian groups were massive players in aid, weren't they? I think I read somewhere they provided something like 90% of aid in 1953.
That's right, a huge contribution. But then comes this trend towards secularization in the decades after.
Why was that?
Well, several reasons. Kraft talks about how some viewed religion as maybe getting in the way of progress, hindering things.
And impartiality, too. Concerns about that.
Big concerns. Could aid really be neutral if it came with a religious tag? Would it be fair? So lots of Christian agencies started to operate much more like secular NGOs, meaning they often separated the spiritual side of things, evangelism, prayer, that kind of thing, from the practical aid, like food, water, shelter.
Right. Keep the doing good separate from the faith stuff.
Pretty much. But that separation, that's where you hit a real challenge when you look at the majority world perspective.
Okay, tell me more. How do they see it differently?
Well, for many, many Christians in the majority world, the spiritual isn't separate. It's woven into everything. Rupen Das says spirituality is never isolated from the rest of life.
So that Western idea of separating faith and practical help, it just doesn't compute for them.
Often, no. They find it, confusing sometimes. Why wouldn't a Christian agency talk about faith? Why wouldn't they connect with the local churches?
That's fascinating. It makes you think about how we even define poverty.
Exactly. The source material points out that in the Bible and in many majority world cultures, the focus is less on the abstract idea of poverty and more on the poor as people, or this concept of ill-being.
Ill-being. What does that encompass?
It's broader than just lacking money or stuff. Das argues it's about broken relationships, lack of dignity, spiritual emptiness, a much deeper, more holistic view.
Like Gutierrez said, poverty is scandalous, contrary to God's will. It's not just an economic problem.
Precisely. It's an affront to human dignity, created in God's image.
And we should probably also distinguish between different types of poverty, right?
Right.
There's the long-term chronic kind.
Yes, which needs development work, long-term solutions.
And then there's the poverty caused by sudden events, disasters, wars.
Right, event-based poverty. That's typically where humanitarian action comes in, focused, time-bound relief.
And the scale of that need right now, it's just staggering. The UNHCR figures from 2019 showed record levels of displacement.
Unprecedented. And it puts enormous strain on the whole humanitarian system, secular and Christian alike.
Which brings us back to those theological tensions, doesn't it? Like the relationship between sharing faith and giving aid.
The Micah Declaration in 2001 tried to bridge that gap with this idea of integral mission.
Integral mission, meaning?
Meaning that proclaiming the gospel, sharing the message and demonstrating it through practical love and service, They're not separate. They're two sides of the same coin,
Right.
integrated.
Okay, that makes sense conceptually, but how does that actually work on the ground? Did the Declaration sort that out?
It linked them, which was important, but it didn't fully spell out the how-to in every situation, especially avoiding any hint of, forcing faith on people. That's still debated.
And there's also the whole question of socioeconomic transformation. Is that biblical? How is it different from, say, the old social gospel movement?
Right. The social gospel, often linked with liberal theology, caused huge splits back in the day. You had dispensationalists focused almost entirely on saving souls for the afterlife.
Versus the social gospel folks wanting to reform society here and now.
Exactly. Big division. And you see echoes of these tensions later, for example, in Latin America.
With liberation theology and Pentecostalism.
Yes. Liberation theology really emphasized, becoming aware of injustice conscientization and working for social change, seeing salvation as communal. Gutierrez talked about conversion to the neighbor.
But then Pentecostalism exploded in growth. Wansuk Ma called it a religion of the poor, not for the poor. What was the difference there?
Well, Burdick noted this paradox of numbers. The small, socially focused Christian-based communities often didn't grow as fast as Pentecostal churches.
Why was that, do we think?
Some scholars, like Burgunder and Maries, suggest Pentecostalism resonated more with local cultures, offered a strong sense of community as the poor, maybe more immediate experiences of God's power.
Live mentioned Chilean Pentecostals seeing themselves as sort of islands of peace amidst the chaos.
Right. But it's not black and white. Maries points out both liberation theology and Pentecostalism fostered practices that genuinely helped the poor Bible study, leading to Action Mutual Support Networks.
And Burgunder argues Pentecostalism, even without a direct political agenda initially, often led to real social transformation in people's lives and communities, breaking addiction, strengthening families, that kind of thing.
Exactly. So it's complex. And majority world theologians were pushing back against a simple either way back at the Lausanne Congress in '74.
People like Padilla and Escobar.
Yes. They insisted that responding to human need wasn't just an optional extra for evangelism. It was part of God's mission. The Missio Dei.
Escobar said, we can't ignore the social and political realities people face.
And Padilla stressed that the gospel message itself has social implications. It changes things. They weren't advocating for the old social gospel, but for a whole gospel for the whole person.
That holistic view again, which seems to contrast sharply with a more Western way of seeing things.
It often does. Western thought, going way back to Plato, tends towards dualism, separating the physical world from the spiritual world.
Hybert's model, the two tiers.
Right. You have the natural, secular world down here, governed by science and observable facts. And then up there, you have the supernatural, sacred realm of faith, miracles, God.
And Hybert talked about the excluded middle, didn't he? What's that?
That's the crucial zone between those two tiers. It's where, for many people, especially in the majority world, faith provides answers to the big questions of life, meaning suffering, misfortune, guidance, things that science often doesn't address, and high theology sometimes feels distant from.
So Western humanitarianism, operating mainly in that natural tier,
often misses or ignores that excluded middle. It provides the food, the shelter, but doesn't always engage with those deeper existential needs that are front and center for people in crisis.
Because for them, faith isn't just a Sunday thing. It's how they understand why the crisis happened and how they'll get through it.
Precisely. And Heber called the result of this separation depersonalization ministry gets fragmented. You address physical needs or spiritual needs, but not the whole person living in that messy middle ground.
And this worldview difference, this dualism, it affected how Christian NGOs related to local churches, too.
Yeah, definitely. For a while, there was a trend, maybe a few decades back, for international Christian NGOs to kind of move away from partnering directly with local churches on the ground.
Why was that?
A mix of things. Concerns about the local churches, maybe not having the capacity for large-scale aid distribution, fears about aid being misused for proselytizing.
And probably reflecting that Western tendency to separate the sacred work of the church from the secular work of aid.
That underlying dualism was often part of it, yes. But this often missed the vital role churches play in their communities.
Right. Inge said a church isn't just bricks and mortar. It's a place with history, a living presence.
A sign of God's activity in the world, yeah. And social scientists see it too. Bodenhamer, Sivov, they point out how churches build community identity, social connections, what we call social capital.
Sivov made that point about quality, didn't he? Maybe not the huge scale, but personalized care.
Exactly. A different kind of strength. Quality, personal touch, especially for the most vulnerable.
So are things changing now? Is there more partnership happening?
Thankfully, yes. There's a growing recognition of the benefits. There's a great example of a Lebanese Christian NGO working through local churches to help Syrian refugees.
How does that work? What does each bring?
Well, the NGO brings the technical know-how, the resources, the logistics, but the local church, they bring the community knowledge, the trust, the volunteers, the ability to offer genuine, compassionate care.
Sounds like a powerful combination.
It really is. Local churches know their communities inside out. They're often incredibly effective partners. And research like Das and Hamoud's work on refugee integration,
What did that find?
it showed just how crucial local churches are in helping refugees actually settle and belong in a new place. They provide community, support, belonging.
And there was that other research too, wasn't there, that sometimes the wider community doesn't even see a Christian agency as Christian if it doesn't connect with local believers.
Exactly. Elawari and Ahayar found that. If the international group just flies in, does its thing, and leaves, without engaging the local church, people might just see them as another secular NGO.
Which means they miss a chance to actually strengthen the local church's witness and presence.
A huge missed opportunity. And we also have to remember the context difference. How so? Western Christianity often operates from a position of relative power, resources. Sometimes called the Constantinian context, thinking back to when Christianity became linked with state power.
Whereas many majority world Christians are minorities, sometimes facing persecution.
Yes, often with far fewer resources. And sometimes, unfortunately, the arrival of large, wealthy international Christian agencies can unintentionally have negative impacts on those local churches or institutions. It's a delicate balance.
It keeps coming back to that holistic view, doesn't it? The spiritual and physical being inseparable for so many in the majority world.
It does. In a crisis, people aren't just asking, where's the food? They're asking, why is this happening? Where is God? Those deep existential questions from the excluded middle.
They're looking for Emmanuel, God with us.
Exactly, which connects to this idea of Kairos moments.
Kairos moments.
Critical times. Points in history where God's purposes seem especially active or clear. The source suggests that many Christian aid agencies focus on immediate relief and maybe socioeconomic programs.
Might be missing the bigger picture.
They might lack a robust understanding of God's broader work in history, maybe a limited grasp of eschatology, historical theology, or this concept of Missio Dei, God's overarching mission.
And a huge part of that bigger picture right now is displacement and migration, surely.
Massive. The UN numbers are just mind-boggling. And Christopher Wright makes the point that the movement of people isn't just some side issue in the Bible.
It's central to God's story. Abraham, Moses, the exile, the early church spreading.
All through Scripture. And Jenkins argues that today's migration crisis is actually being used by God for mission, for the Great Commission, even for renewing the church in the West through believers coming from the global South.
And people on the move are often more spiritually open.
McGill's research suggests that, yes, displacement often shakes people up, makes them ask big questions. We see with Iranians, Syrians, Afghans, Chinese migrants. Many are encountering faith in new ways.
So local churches in the majority world might be seeing this as a kairos moment, an opportunity.
Many are, yes. They're reaching out, sharing their faith, building community. But then you have the large international Christian agencies.
Often restricted by policies,
Yeah.
like the Red Cross Code of Conduct limiting direct evangelism.
Often, yes. The intention is good. Avoid coercion, maintain neutrality to ensure access. But it does raise the question, could there be more holistic approaches that respect boundaries but don't completely ignore the spiritual dimension?
It's a tough one.
It is. And Moltmann, drawing on Heschel, talks about God's pathos, God's deep care, God's suffering with creation. God's compassion means God works through all sorts of channels, secular and Christian.
Cool.
But by being purely humanitarian, by maybe holding back from partnering fully with local churches in all aspects of mission, are Christian NGOs missing a unique Kairos moment? Missing seeing how God is powerfully at work through displacement itself.
So, pulling this all together then, the core tension seems to be this historical Western split between the spiritual and the physical.
Yeah, that dualism has really shaped how Western Christian humanitarianism developed. And it's created this disconnect sometimes with the holistic view common in the majority world.
Potentially limiting the full scope of the mission.
Potentially, yes. So the big questions remain. What does it really mean to be a Christian humanitarian agency? How can they partner better, more deeply with local churches?
And are they truly seeing and responding to what God seems to be doing in the world today, especially through the movement of peoples?
Those are the crucial questions, I think.
It really leaves you thinking, what if we, in the West, really grasped that interconnectedness of the spiritual and the physical, the way it's often understood in the majority world? How might that reshape our whole approach to compassion, to aid, to global engagement?
Yeah, reflecting on that excluded middle in times of crisis, what are people really seeking?
And thinking about those examples, churches growing among refugees, what does that tell us about the kind of holistic care people need? And maybe how aid groups could work differently? Lots to ponder there.
Definitely. A really important area to keep exploring.